If you've found yourself here tonight, welcome. Maybe you're coming home after a long, draining day at work, or it's your day off, and you're searching for something quiet, something soft to ease you into sleep. Maybe you're a student, your brain still buzzing from books and deadlines, or maybe you're just lying there, restless, hoping the night will be kind and slow. Whatever brought you here, I'm really glad you made it. You don't need to do anything right now. No pressure, no urgency. Let the tension melt from your shoulders, unclench your jaw, and take a slow, deep breath. Inhale, exhale. You're safe here, and you're not alone. My only job tonight is to keep you company, to speak gently while you close your eyes, and to guide your thoughts somewhere far away, into a little pocket of the past that's both strange and oddly beautiful. Tonight we're going back to the summer of 1474, to the cobblestone streets of Basel, Switzerland, a medieval city where law and superstition often walked hand in hand. It's here that something truly unexpected happened, a trial, but not just any trial. The accused was a rooster, yes, a barnyard rooster, brought before a court of law, facing charges no animal could ever understand, and yet, his fate would stir an entire city. This is the story of a creature caught between faith, fear, and folklore, a time when the unknown was explained through ancient beliefs, and even a simple crow at dawn could raise suspicions of something darker. But don't worry, I'll tell you everything, slowly and calmly. All you need to do is listen, and drift. Let your mind travel gently back in time, to a world where the line between the natural and the supernatural was fragile, and sometimes even feathered. And if this quiet story brings you any comfort tonight, if these softly told journeys help you rest, feel free to leave a like or subscribe, so I can be here again tomorrow evening, with another quiet corner of forgotten history, just for you. Sleep well, and when you're ready, we'll begin. Chapter 1. A Devilish Discovery. The morning mist clung to the narrow streets of Basel as August 1474 began like any other month in this prosperous Swiss city, where the convergence of trade routes and the steady flow of the Rhine River had created a community that thrived on commerce, craftsmanship, and the comfortable rhythms of medieval urban life. The Rhine River flowed steadily past the settlement, its waters carrying trade goods from the German heartlands, and whispered news from distant lands where merchants ventured to seek their fortunes in markets that stretched from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The city itself presented the typical appearance of a successful medieval trading center, its walls rising from the riverbank to encompass a maze of timber-framed houses, narrow cobblestone streets, and the impressive stone structures that spoke of accumulated wealth and civic pride. The cathedral towers dominated the skyline, their bells marking the hours that governed the daily lives of citizens who had never known a world without their reassuring presence. In the workshops of skilled craftsmen scattered throughout the city's quarters, the day's work was already underway in the grey light that preceded sunrise, following patterns established by generations of artisans who had passed their knowledge from father to son. The gentle tap of hammers on metal echoed from the blacksmith's forges, where apprentices pumped bellows to maintain the fires that would transform raw iron into tools, weapons, and household implements essential to medieval life. The scraping of leather being worked into useful goods provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the metalwork, as tanners and cobblers applied techniques perfected over centuries to create the boots, saddles, and countless other items that made civilized life possible. The quiet conversations of merchants discussing the day's transactions filled the air around market stalls, where goods from across Europe waited for buyers who understood their value and could afford their cost. But on this particular morning, in a modest courtyard, tucked between the timber-framed houses that lined one of the city's winding streets, something extraordinary was about to unfold that would challenge every assumption the citizens of Basel held about the natural order of their world. The courtyard belonged to a family of modest means, perhaps a tradesman who had achieved sufficient success to own his own workshop, or a small merchant whose ventures in local commerce had provided enough prosperity to maintain a household with the basic comforts of medieval middle-class life. The family itself represented the backbone of Basel's community, hard-working, God-fearing citizens who attended Mass regularly, paid their taxes without complaint, and contributed to the city's prosperity through their honest labor and participation in the complex web of relationships that bound the community together. They were the sort of people who kept a few chickens for eggs and the occasional Sunday meal, who maintained their property with pride despite its modest size, and who raised their children to respect authority, and understand their place in the divinely ordained hierarchy that governed medieval society. Picture yourself standing in this small enclosed space, surrounded by the familiar sounds and scents of medieval domestic life that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. The air carries the comforting scent of cooking fires, burning wood that had been carefully gathered and stored for the winter months ahead, the earthy smell of straw and animal bedding that spoke of the intimate relationship between humans and the creatures that provided them with food and clothing, and the faint but appetizing aroma of bread baking in nearby ovens, where neighborhood families took turns using facilities that no single household could afford to maintain alone. The courtyard itself was typical of urban domestic spaces in medieval Basel, a carefully planned area that maximized the utility of every square foot while providing the basic amenities necessary for family life. Chickens pecked and scratched in the dirt with the focused intensity of creatures whose entire existence revolved around the search for grain, insects, and other edible materials that would sustain them through another day. Their soft clucking created a peaceful backdrop to the morning's activities, a sound so familiar to urban dwellers that it had become part of the unconscious rhythm of daily life. The space was organized with the practical efficiency that characterized medieval domestic arrangements, where every corner served multiple purposes and nothing was wasted or left idle. Wooden coops provided shelter for the birds during harsh weather, while feeding areas were strategically placed to make the daily care of the animals as convenient as possible for family members whose many responsibilities left little time for unnecessary effort. The rooster, the central figure of our tale, and the soon-to-be defendant in one of history's most unusual legal proceedings, was likely an ordinary bird in every respect that medieval eyes could observe. Perhaps he displayed the typical russet and black plumage that marked his breed, the bright red comb that proclaimed his masculinity and dominance, and the proud bearing that established his position as the undisputed master of this small domestic flock. He would have been a familiar sight to the family members who saw him daily, strutting about the courtyard with the confidence of a creature who understood his role and responsibilities within the carefully ordered world of the household. His daily routine included protecting his hens from the various threats that urban life presented, announcing each dawn with his characteristic crow that served as an unofficial timepiece for the neighborhood, and maintaining the social order among the birds through a combination of displays, challenges, and occasional physical intervention. The rooster's behavior, prior to the extraordinary discovery that would change everything, followed patterns that had been observed and understood by countless generations of people who depended upon domestic fowl for their survival. His territorial displays, his protective instincts toward the hens, and his vocal announcements of significant events all conformed to expectations based on centuries of human observation of avian behavior. But on this fateful morning, as the family members went about their usual routine of caring for the birds and collecting the eggs that would provide protein for their breakfast, something was discovered that would transform this unremarkable bird into the subject of citywide panic and legal proceedings that would be remembered for centuries. Hidden among the usual collection of hens' eggs in their familiar nesting boxes, someone found something that shouldn't exist according to the natural order as medieval people understood it, an egg that appeared to have been laid by the rooster himself. The discovery itself probably occurred in the most mundane circumstances imaginable. As a family member, perhaps one of the children assigned to gather eggs as part of their daily chores, reached into the straw-lined nesting area, where the hens typically deposited their contributions to the household economy. The routine nature of this task made the extraordinary discovery even more shocking, as hands expecting to find familiar objects encountered something that challenged every assumption about the natural world. The egg itself, according to the fragmentary records that survive from this extraordinary case, appeared to be smaller than the usual hen's eggs, but otherwise unremarkable in its physical characteristics. Its shell displayed the typical color and texture that medieval people associated with fresh eggs, and its weight and feel provided no immediate indication that anything unusual had occurred. Only its alleged source, the household's male rooster, marked it as an object of supernatural significance. To comprehend the terror this discovery inspired throughout Basel and the surrounding region, you must understand the medieval mind's complex relationship with the natural world, a worldview that differed fundamentally from modern scientific understanding in ways that made the rooster's transgression far more threatening than any contemporary observer could possibly imagine. In 1474, the boundaries between what we would now call science and superstition were not clearly defined, and indeed such distinctions would have been meaningless to people who saw the entire universe as a unified system governed by divine will and constantly subject to interference by supernatural forces. The world, as medieval people understood it, was essentially a stage where divine and demonic forces constantly battled for human souls, with every natural phenomenon serving as potential evidence of this cosmic struggle. Any deviation from the expected order of nature was viewed with deep suspicion and immediate concern, as such anomalies were interpreted as signs that the careful balance between good and evil had been disturbed in ways that threatened the spiritual welfare of the entire community. The rooster's egg was not simply a biological curiosity that might be studied and explained through careful observation and rational analysis. Instead, it was perceived as a harbinger of evil, a tangible sign that dark forces were at work in the very heart of their community, corrupting the natural order that God had established to govern his creation. The implications of this discovery extended far beyond the immediate household to encompass the spiritual safety of every soul in Basel. Medieval folklore, preserved through generations of oral tradition and written accounts that blended observation with supernatural interpretation, held that such eggs possessed properties that made them far more dangerous than their innocent appearance might suggest. According to these beliefs, which were accepted as factual by educated and uneducated people alike, rooster eggs that were left to hatch would produce not ordinary chicks, but basilisks, serpentine creatures whose very gaze could kill a man, and whose presence could corrupt the spiritual atmosphere of an entire region. The mere existence of such an egg was thought to indicate that Satan himself had taken a personal interest in their small corner of the world, using the innocent rooster as an unwitting instrument in some larger scheme designed to spread corruption and evil throughout the Christian community. This interpretation transformed what might have been dismissed as a natural anomaly into a crisis that demanded immediate and decisive action from both secular and religious authorities. Imagine the growing circle of neighbors who came to witness this unnatural phenomenon as word of the discovery spread beyond the confines of the family's modest courtyard. The news traveled quickly through the narrow streets of Basel, carried on the lips of servants returning from market, with gossip that proved far more interesting than the usual discussions of prices and availability of goods. Women drawing water from the public wells found themselves sharing whispered conversations about events that seemed to confirm their deepest fears about the supernatural threats that constantly surrounded their daily lives. The story spread through the city's social networks with the speed that only truly shocking news can achieve, moving from household to household, workshop to workshop, and marketplace to marketplace as citizens struggled to understand the implications of what had occurred in their midst. Craftsmen paused in their work to discuss the discovery with colleagues and customers, while merchants found their business conversations constantly interrupted by speculation about the meaning of these extraordinary events. The rooster's egg became the talk of the city within hours of its discovery, a source of both morbid fascination and genuine terror that dominated conversations in every quarter of Basel. Citizens who had previously concerned themselves with the mundane matters of daily life, the price of grain, the quality of craftsmanship, the behavior of their children, suddenly found themselves confronting questions about the nature of evil and the adequacy of their spiritual defenses against supernatural assault. The medieval worldview that shaped these reactions was based on centuries of Christian teaching that emphasized the constant presence of spiritual warfare in every aspect of human existence. All of creation, according to this understanding, followed divine patterns that had been established by God at the moment of creation, and maintained through his ongoing intervention in natural processes. Birds of different species behaved in predictable ways that reflected their assigned roles in the cosmic order, and any deviation from these patterns suggested supernatural intervention that could only come from sources opposed to divine will. A rooster laying an egg was not merely unusual or unprecedented. It was seen as a fundamental violation of natural law that challenged the very foundations of the created order. Such an event could only occur if powerful supernatural forces had intervened to corrupt the normal processes of nature, and the most likely explanation for such intervention was the direct influence of Satan or his demonic servants working to spread chaos and evil throughout God's creation. The theological implications of this interpretation were staggering for people whose entire understanding of reality was based on the assumption that God maintained control over his creation through natural laws that reflected his perfect wisdom and unchanging character. If these laws could be violated by evil forces, then the reliability of the entire natural order was called into question, and the spiritual safety of every Christian soul was potentially at risk. As news of the discovery spread throughout Basel and the surrounding countryside, the initial shock and disbelief gave way to a deeper, more troubling question that would ultimately determine the rooster's fate. What should be done with this creature that had apparently become an instrument of evil? The townspeople of Basel were not about to ignore what they perceived as a clear and immediate threat to their spiritual welfare and the safety of their community. In their minds, this was not simply a matter of disposing of an unusual bird through normal means, such as slaughtering it for food or selling it to another household. The rooster's alleged transgression had transformed it from an ordinary domestic animal into something far more dangerous, a creature that had been touched by supernatural evil and might serve as a conduit for further demonic influence, if not dealt with properly, according to both legal and religious requirements. The question of appropriate response was complicated by the fact that medieval law recognized various categories of crimes and punishments, with different procedures required depending on the nature of the offense and the status of the accused. While animals were rarely the subjects of formal legal proceedings, precedents existed for situations where creatures were believed to have been used by supernatural forces to commit acts that threatened the community's welfare. The atmosphere in Basel grew increasingly tense as more people learned of the rooster's transgression and began to consider its implications for their own safety and that of their families. Mothers clutched their children closer as they passed the courtyard, where the infamous bird still strutted about, seemingly unaware of the panic his alleged egg had caused throughout the city. The normal routines of daily life continued, but with an undercurrent of anxiety that affected every aspect of community interaction. Merchants in the marketplace found their usual discussions of trade and commerce constantly interrupted by speculation about what other unnatural phenomena might be lurking in their midst, waiting to manifest themselves in ways that could threaten the spiritual or physical safety of innocent citizens. The discovery of one supernatural anomaly raised the terrifying possibility that their community had become a target for broader demonic assault that might include additional manifestations of evil. Medieval people lived in a world where the supernatural was never far from the surface of daily life, where the boundary between the natural and the miraculous was thin and constantly permeable. They knew the stories that had been passed down through generations about witches who could transform themselves into animals, about demons who could possess innocent creatures and use them for evil purposes, and about the countless ways that Satan worked to corrupt God's creation and lead human souls toward damnation. The rooster's egg fit perfectly into this worldview, confirming their deepest fears about the constant presence of malevolent forces in their world and validating the warnings they had received from religious authorities about the need for eternal vigilance against supernatural threats. The discovery provided tangible evidence that the cosmic battle between good and evil was not merely an abstract theological concept, but a real and immediate concern that could manifest itself in the most unexpected and ordinary circumstances. Religious authorities throughout Basel and the surrounding region were consulted as the community struggled to understand the proper response to this unprecedented situation. Priests, monks, and other learned men pored over ancient texts seeking guidance on how to respond to supernatural manifestations that challenged the normal order of creation. Their libraries contained centuries of accumulated wisdom about dealing with demonic influence, but few, if any, precedents existed for addressing the specific situation of a rooster that had apparently violated the fundamental laws of its nature. The consensus that emerged from these scholarly consultations was clear and unambiguous. This was not a matter that could be handled quietly or dismissed as mere superstition by people who preferred to avoid confronting uncomfortable realities. The welfare of the entire community was at stake, and decisive action was required to protect innocent citizens from the spiritual contamination that such supernatural anomalies were believed to spread throughout their environment. The theological authorities who were consulted emphasized that the appearance of such phenomena was not accidental or random, but represented deliberate attacks by evil forces that required equally deliberate responses from the Christian community. To ignore or minimize the significance of the rooster's transgression would be to invite further supernatural assault and to demonstrate a lack of proper concern for the spiritual welfare of the population. The rooster himself, meanwhile, continued his daily routine with the oblivious consistency that characterized his species, pecking at grain scattered in the courtyard, preening his feathers with the careful attention that birds devoted to maintaining their plumage, and maintaining his position as the dominant male in the small flock, through displays and challenges that followed patterns established by countless generations of his ancestors. He had no understanding of the terror his alleged egg had inspired throughout the human community that surrounded him, no awareness that he had become the center of a supernatural crisis that would soon engulf the entire city and beyond. His behavior remained entirely consistent with normal rooster behavior, showing no signs of the demonic influence that the community believed had corrupted his essential nature. The contrast between the bird's normal appearance and behavior, and the extraordinary claims being made about his supernatural significance, created a cognitive dissonance that only served to increase the anxiety felt by those who observed him. The fact that evil could hide behind such an ordinary appearance was itself seen as evidence of Satan's cunning and his ability to corrupt God's creation in ways that might escape detection until it was too late to prevent spiritual disaster. As the days passed following the initial discovery, the panic that had initially gripped the community began to crystallize into determination and resolve. The good people of Basel would not allow this affront to divine order to go unchallenged or unpunished. They would take action, not only to protect themselves from the immediate threat posed by the corrupted rooster, but to send a clear message that their community would not tolerate any manifestation of evil, no matter how seemingly insignificant or innocent it might appear. The decision to pursue formal legal action against the rooster reflected the community's commitment to addressing supernatural threats through established institutional procedures, rather than resorting to vigilante justice or mob violence. This approach demonstrated both the sophistication of medieval legal systems and the serious nature of the threat that the community believed it was facing. The legal proceedings that would follow would require the participation of judges, lawyers, and other officials who possessed the knowledge and authority necessary to conduct a proper trial according to established procedures. The fact that the defendant would be a rooster rather than a human being created unprecedented challenges, but medieval law was flexible enough to accommodate unusual circumstances when the welfare of the community was at stake. The stage was set for what would become one of the most remarkable legal proceedings in medieval history, a trial that would demonstrate the complex intersection of law, theology, and popular belief in a society that took supernatural threats as seriously as any other form of criminal activity. The rooster's fate would soon rest in the hands of Basel's judicial system, where learned men would debate questions of law, theology, and natural philosophy in an attempt to determine the appropriate response to this unprecedented situation. The medieval mind, with its complex blend of logical reasoning and supernatural interpretation, was about to demonstrate how seriously it took the threat of demonic corruption and the measures it was willing to take to protect the spiritual welfare of the community. The Rooster of Basel was about to become the defendant in a trial that would reveal the deepest fears, beliefs, and values of an entire civilization, confronting what it perceived as a direct assault by the forces of evil on the divine order that governed their world. The proceedings that would unfold over the coming weeks would provide unprecedented insight into the medieval understanding of justice, responsibility, and the relationship between the natural and supernatural worlds. The rooster, innocent of any conscious wrongdoing but condemned by circumstances beyond his comprehension, would become a symbol of the eternal human struggle to understand and control forces that seem to operate beyond the boundaries of rational explanation or conventional response. Chapter 2: Courtroom of Curiosities. The wheels of justice in medieval Basel moved with the same deliberate precision that governed all aspects of civic life in this prosperous Swiss city, where centuries of accumulated legal tradition and scholarly learning had created a judicial system that prided itself on thorough consideration of even the most complex and unprecedented cases. Within days of the rooster's discovery, the city's authorities had reached a momentous decision that would reverberate through the halls of learning throughout Europe. This matter was too serious, too potentially dangerous to the spiritual welfare of the community, to be handled through informal means or dismissed as mere superstition. The bird would face trial in a proper court of law, with all the ceremony, legal rigor, and scholarly debate that such proceedings demanded under the established traditions of medieval jurisprudence. This decision reflected not only the gravity with which the authorities viewed the supernatural threat, but also their commitment to addressing even the most extraordinary circumstances through established legal procedures rather than resorting to mob justice or arbitrary punishment. The announcement of the formal trial sent waves of excitement and apprehension throughout Basel and the surrounding regions, as word spread that legal history was about to be made within their city walls. Citizens who had never before shown interest in judicial proceedings suddenly found themselves eager to witness what promised to be the most extraordinary legal spectacle of their lifetimes. The Rooster's case had transcended its origins as a local curiosity to become a matter of broader legal and theological significance that would test the very foundations of medieval jurisprudence. Picture yourself in the Great Hall where Basel's most important judicial proceedings took place, a magnificent chamber that embodied the city's commitment to the proper administration of justice and its reverence for the legal traditions that had been passed down through generations of learned scholars. The room was dominated by heavy wooden beams of dark oak that supported the vaulted ceiling, their massive timbers speaking of both permanence and strength, while tall Gothic windows allowed streams of dusty sunlight to illuminate the proceedings, with the kind of dramatic lighting that seemed appropriate for such momentous events. The architecture itself reflected the medieval understanding of justice as a divine institution that required appropriate dignity and solemnity in its earthly manifestation. Every element of the chamber's design, from the raised platform where the judges would sit to the carefully carved decorations that adorned the walls, served to reinforce the sacred nature of the legal proceedings that took place within these hallowed spaces. The air inside the chamber was thick with the scent of beeswax candles that provided supplementary illumination for the reading of documents and the examination of evidence, their warm light flickering across the faces of the assembled participants. The musty smell of parchment and leather-bound legal texts pervaded the atmosphere, speaking of the countless hours that scholars had spent studying the precedents and principles that would guide their deliberations in this unprecedented case. Along the walls, elaborate tapestries depicting scenes of justice, divine judgment, and the triumph of law over chaos served as silent witnesses to the extraordinary trial about to unfold. These artistic masterpieces, commissioned by the city's wealthy merchants and crafted by the finest artisans available, reminded all present that human justice was meant to reflect divine justice, and that their proceedings took place under the watchful eyes of higher authorities who would ultimately judge their own judgments. The judicial system of 1474 Basel was no crude medieval parody of justice, no gathering of superstitious peasants dispensing rough frontier punishment based on fear and ignorance. These were learned men, trained in both civil and canon law at the finest universities of Europe, who took their responsibilities seriously and approached their duties with the same scholarly rigor that their academic counterparts brought to questions of theology, philosophy, and natural science. But never before in their extensive experience had they been called upon to determine the fate of a creature accused of violating the fundamental laws of nature itself. Never had they faced a case that challenged their understanding of the relationship between natural and supernatural phenomena with such directness and urgency. The Rooster's trial would test not only their legal knowledge, but their philosophical understanding of the cosmos and their theological grasp of the eternal struggle between good and evil. They had presided over cases involving wealthy merchants whose commercial disputes required sophisticated understanding of international trade law, skilled craftsmen whose guild regulations demanded careful interpretation of complex professional standards, and noble families whose inheritance claims involved intricate questions of feudal law and ancient privilege. They had decided matters of contract interpretation that affected the prosperity of entire industries, resolved boundary disputes that had simmered for generations, and adjudicated criminal accusations that ranged from simple theft to complex cases of treason and heresy. The Rooster was brought into the courtroom in a cage that had been specially constructed for the occasion, its bars designed to ensure both security and visibility, while maintaining the dignity appropriate to formal legal proceedings. The bird appeared still seemingly oblivious to the gravity of his situation, his demeanor no different from what it had been during his days of freedom in the family courtyard, where his alleged transgression had first been discovered. Imagine the sight that greeted the assembled officials, spectators, and learned observers who had gathered to witness this unprecedented event. A proud bird, his feathers still glossy with the health that spoke of good care and proper feeding, his bright red comb standing erect as a natural crown that proclaimed his status as a male of his species, his dark eyes alert and intelligent as he surveyed his strange new surroundings with the cautious curiosity that characterized his kind. He pecked occasionally at the bars of his cage, perhaps hoping for the grain that had always appeared when humans approached him in the past, completely unaware that he stood accused of crimes against both natural and divine law that could result in punishments more severe than any barnyard creature had ever faced. His behavior remained entirely consistent with normal rooster conduct, showing no signs of the supernatural corruption that had allegedly transformed him into an instrument of evil. The charges against the rooster were read aloud in the solemn Latin that marked all formal legal proceedings in medieval Europe, the ancient language lending gravity and authority to accusations that would have seemed absurd if expressed in the vernacular tongues of daily conversation. The clerk's voice echoed through the hall with the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to proclaiming matters of life and death, as he described the unnatural act of egg-laying, the threat to community welfare, and the suspicion of supernatural corruption that had brought this creature before the bar of justice. Each word was carefully chosen according to established legal formulas, each accusation precisely formulated according to the judicial standards that had been developed through centuries of legal scholarship and practical application. The language employed drew upon precedents from cases involving witchcraft, demonic possession, and other manifestations of supernatural evil, adapted to address the unique circumstances of a bird that had allegedly transcended the limitations of its natural role in the divine order. The formal reading of the charges required nearly an hour, as the clerk methodically outlined not only the specific allegations against the Rooster, but also the legal theories that made such charges possible under the complex system of laws that governed medieval society. The document cited authorities ranging from ancient Roman legal codes to recent papal pronouncements, creating a comprehensive framework that placed the Rooster's alleged crimes within the broader context of ongoing spiritual warfare between the forces of good and evil. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this trial, the element that most clearly demonstrated the sophistication and fairness of medieval legal procedures, despite their supernatural context, was the appointment of legal counsel for the defendant. Medieval justice, despite its many flaws and the obvious limitations imposed by the scientific and philosophical understanding of the time, recognized the fundamental principle that every accused creature deserved representation by someone capable of presenting their case with skill and dedication. A young advocate was assigned to defend the Rooster, a man whose reputation for learning and integrity had already established him as one of Basel's most promising legal minds despite his relative youth. This appointment was not made lightly, or as a mere formality to satisfy procedural requirements, but represented a serious effort to ensure that even this most unusual defendant would receive the same quality of representation that would be provided to any human being facing similar charges. The advocate who accepted this challenging assignment was a scholar who had studied at the University of Bologna, where he had distinguished himself in both civil and canon law, before returning to Basel to establish his practice among the city's educated elite. His previous cases had involved some of the most complex legal questions of his era, and his reputation for thorough preparation and innovative argumentation had earned him the respect of colleagues and opponents alike. The young lawyer would soon demonstrate both exceptional legal acumen and considerable moral courage in his defense of this most unusual client, approaching the case with the same methodical preparation and passionate advocacy that he would have brought to defending any human being facing accusations that could result in severe punishment. His willingness to take on such a controversial case, despite the potential risks to his professional reputation, spoke to both his commitment to justice and his confidence in his ability to present effective arguments, even under the most challenging circumstances. The advocate's task was seemingly impossible, presenting challenges that no law school curriculum had ever contemplated or legal textbook had ever addressed. How does one defend a rooster accused of laying an egg when multiple witnesses had seen the evidence with their own eyes? How does one argue against physical evidence that appeared to confirm supernatural corruption of the natural order? How does one present legal arguments on behalf of a client who cannot speak, cannot understand the proceedings, and cannot provide any assistance in developing a defense strategy? Yet the young lawyer approached his case with the same systematic methodology he would have brought to defending any human client, beginning with a thorough investigation of the facts, a comprehensive review of applicable legal precedents, and a careful analysis of the philosophical and theological principles that might be relevant to his client's situation. His preparation involved consultations with scholars of natural philosophy, theologians specializing in questions of demonic influence, and legal experts who had studied similar cases from other jurisdictions. His first line of defense, when the trial proceedings began in earnest, was deceptively simple yet philosophically profound, striking at the very heart of medieval legal theory, and challenging the prosecution to justify their charges according to the most fundamental principles of jurisprudence. He argued with compelling logic and extensive citation of authority that the rooster's alleged crime was involuntary, an act that occurred without conscious intention or deliberate choice. In medieval legal theory, as the advocate demonstrated through references to the greatest legal scholars of the age, true guilt required not just the commission of a prohibited act, but the deliberate intention to commit that act. This principle, known as mens rea, or guilty mind, was fundamental to the entire structure of medieval criminal law, and distinguished between actions that deserved punishment and those that were merely unfortunate accidents or the result of circumstances beyond the actor's control. Could a rooster, the advocate asked with penetrating logic that forced the court to grapple with fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and moral responsibility. Be held accountable for an involuntary bodily function. Did the bird make a conscious choice to lay an egg, or was this something that had been done to him by forces beyond his control, beyond his understanding, and beyond his ability to resist? The courtroom fell into profound silence as the advocate developed this argument with the skill and passion that had made him one of Basel's most respected legal minds, his words echoing through the chamber with the authority of a scholar who had mastered the complexities of legal theory and could apply them to even the most unprecedented circumstances. Picture the faces of the assembled judges, their expressions grave and thoughtful as they considered this novel application of legal principle to a situation that challenged every assumption they had made about the relationship between law, nature, and supernatural influence. The scribe's quill scratched continuously against parchment as he recorded each word of the defense, creating a permanent record of this extraordinary moment in legal history, when the principles of jurisprudence were tested against circumstances that their original framers could never have imagined. The sound of his writing provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the advocate's voice, emphasizing the historic nature of the proceedings and the importance of preserving every argument for future study and reference. The advocate's second argument was even more daring, representing a frontal assault on the very premises underlying the prosecution's case and challenging the court to reconsider their understanding of the relationship between natural and supernatural phenomena. He challenged the fundamental assumption that the rooster's alleged egg-laying necessarily indicated supernatural corruption, invoking the highest authorities of theological scholarship to support his position. Drawing upon the writings of Saint Augustine, whose Confessions and City of God had established him as one of the most authoritative voices in Christian theology, as well as other church fathers, whose works formed the foundation of medieval religious thought, the advocate argued with impressive erudition that even Satan himself could not compel a creature to sin without that creature's willing participation in the corruption. This line of reasoning struck at the very heart of medieval demonology and forced the assembled judges to grapple with fundamental questions about the nature of evil, the limits of demonic power, and the requirements for spiritual corruption that had been debated by theologians for centuries. If the rooster was incapable of understanding the difference between good and evil, if he could not consciously choose to ally himself with forces opposed to divine will, how could he be held responsible for supernatural corruption that required deliberate rebellion against God? The advocate's theological arguments were supported by extensive citations from the most respected authorities, including Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica had established the framework for understanding the relationship between reason, faith, and moral responsibility that dominated medieval intellectual life. He quoted passages that emphasized the importance of free will in moral decision-making, and the impossibility of true sin without conscious choice, building a case that the rooster's alleged transgression could not constitute genuine evil, regardless of its apparent supernatural character. This line of reasoning transformed what had begun as a simple case of alleged sorcery into a complex theological and philosophical debate that engaged some of the most profound questions that medieval thinkers had ever attempted to address. The advocate had elevated his client's case from the level of local superstition to the realm of serious intellectual discourse, forcing the court to consider issues that had implications far beyond the fate of a single bird. The young lawyer's arguments were not merely academic exercises designed to demonstrate his learning or to impress his colleagues with his mastery of legal and theological scholarship. He spoke with genuine passion about the injustice of condemning an innocent creature based on superstition and fear, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who believed deeply in the principles he was defending and who saw his client's case as a test of the entire legal system's commitment to justice and rational deliberation. He reminded the court that God's justice was perfect and merciful, characterized by wisdom that transcended human understanding and compassion that extended to all of creation. Would the Almighty, he asked, with rhetorical power that moved even his opponents, truly hold a simple barnyard bird responsible for phenomena beyond its understanding or control? Would divine justice, which served as the model for all human judicial proceedings, condemn a creature that lacked the capacity for moral choice? The advocate's emotional appeal was grounded in solid theological principle, drawing upon the medieval understanding of divine attributes and the relationship between divine and human justice. His arguments suggested that condemning the rooster would be not only legally unsound, but theologically problematic, potentially placing the court in the position of acting contrary to the divine justice they were supposed to reflect and uphold. The prosecution, however, was not without its own compelling arguments, presented by experienced legal scholars who had consulted extensively with religious authorities throughout the region and who could cite their own impressive array of precedents and authorities to support their case. The city's legal officials had worked closely with theologians who pointed to biblical precedents for the supernatural possession of animals, cases where demonic forces had successfully corrupted innocent creatures and used them as instruments for spreading evil throughout the world. Had not Christ himself, the prosecutors argued with their own impressive command of scriptural authority, allowed demons to enter a herd of swine, demonstrating that evil spirits could indeed corrupt animal subjects and use them for supernatural purposes. The Gospel accounts provided clear evidence that demonic possession of animals was not only possible, but had actually occurred under the direct observation of divine authority, establishing an unmistakable precedent for the charges being brought against the rooster. If evil spirits could corrupt pigs, as the biblical account clearly demonstrated, why should anyone doubt their ability to corrupt roosters in similar fashion? The very existence of the egg, the prosecutors maintained with logic that seemed irrefutable to minds steeped in supernatural worldview, was proof that unnatural forces were at work in this case. No normal rooster could lay an egg, therefore the presence of an egg allegedly laid by a rooster could only be explained through supernatural intervention. Furthermore, the prosecution argued with considerable force. The community had not only the right, but the duty to protect itself from such corruption before it could spread to other animals, other households, or other aspects of daily life. The rooster's alleged transgression was not merely an isolated curiosity, but potentially the first manifestation of a broader demonic assault on their community that could escalate into far more serious threats if not addressed decisively through proper legal channels. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly tense, as both sides presented their cases with the skill and passion that marked the finest examples of medieval advocacy, their arguments revealing the depth of learning and the complexity of thought that characterized the legal and theological scholarship of the era. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered in the city squares and marketplaces, discussing the proceedings with the intensity that accompanied any event of major civic importance, and speculating about the outcome with the fervor of people who understood that the trial's resolution would establish important precedents for their entire community. Merchants paused in their daily business to debate the legal and theological implications of the case, their conversations revealing the sophisticated understanding of complex issues that characterized educated medieval society. In taverns and workshops, citizens argued about the nature of justice, the reality of supernatural threats, and the proper response to unexplained phenomena, their discussions demonstrating the broad public interest in intellectual questions that modern observers might consider purely academic. The rooster himself remained largely passive throughout the proceedings, his behavior providing a stark contrast to the intense human drama unfolding around him. He occasionally preened his feathers with the careful attention that birds devoted to maintaining their plumage, pecked at the floor of his cage in search of edible materials, or stretched his neck to observe the strange activities of the humans who surrounded him. He had no understanding of the learned arguments being made on his behalf, no awareness that his fate hung in the balance of complex legal and theological debates that engaged some of the finest minds of his era. He was simply a bird, caught in the web of human fears and superstitions that had transformed him from a common barnyard creature into the defendant in one of history's most unusual trials. His innocence of any conscious wrongdoing was evident in every aspect of his behavior, yet this very innocence raised profound questions about the nature of justice and the proper response to phenomena that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries of natural law. The judges deliberated for hours that stretched into days, poring over legal texts that had been gathered from libraries throughout the region, and consulting with religious authorities, whose expertise in questions of supernatural influence had been recognized by ecclesiastical hierarchies throughout Europe. They weighed the advocates' arguments about involuntary action and the limits of animal consciousness against the prosecution's claims about supernatural corruption and community safety, recognizing that their decision would establish precedents with implications extending far beyond the immediate case. The very foundations of medieval jurisprudence were being tested by this unprecedented situation, forcing legal scholars to grapple with questions that had never before arisen in practical contexts despite their theoretical importance. The relationship between natural and supernatural law, the requirements for moral responsibility, the proper response to unexplained phenomena, all of these issues demanded careful consideration and thoughtful resolution that could stand the scrutiny of future scholars and legal practitioners. As the deliberations continued, the courtroom filled with tension that reflected the broader community's anxiety about the outcome and its implications for their understanding of justice, supernatural threats, and the proper relationship between human and divine authority. The outcome of this trial would establish important precedents about the limits of legal responsibility, the nature of supernatural corruption, and the proper response to phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of natural law. The Rooster's fate would send a clear message to the entire community about how they should understand and respond to the mysteries of the natural world, whether they should approach unexplained phenomena with skepticism and rational analysis, or treat them as evidence of supernatural intervention that required immediate and decisive action. The decision would reflect the medieval mind's attempt to balance legal principle with theological doctrine, rational analysis with supernatural belief, and individual justice with community safety. The medieval mind, with its complex blend of logical reasoning and supernatural interpretation, its commitment to both scholarly analysis and religious faith, was about to render its verdict on one of the most extraordinary legal questions ever posed to a judicial tribunal. The Rooster of Basel awaited his fate, still pecking at his cage with the oblivious consistency that characterized his species, still unaware that he had become the center of a debate that would echo through the centuries as a testament to the fears, beliefs, and intellectual sophistication of an entire civilization. The stage was set for a verdict that would reveal the deepest convictions of medieval society about justice and injustice, about the relationship between natural and supernatural phenomena, about the proper response to threats that seemed to transcend normal human experience, and about the constant battle between good and evil that they believed shaped every aspect of their daily lives and determined the ultimate fate of every soul within their community. Chapter 3. Verdict: Guilty as charged. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Basel as the court prepared to reconvene for the final phase of this extraordinary trial that had captured the attention of learned men throughout the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. The night had been restless for many in the city, as citizens lay awake contemplating the implications of the proceedings they had witnessed, their minds wrestling with questions that challenged their fundamental understanding of justice, divine will, and the proper relationship between human authority and supernatural forces. In taverns that normally echoed with discussions of trade prices and local gossip, the conversations had turned to weightier matters as merchants, craftsmen, and common citizens debated the nature of justice, the reality of supernatural threats, and the proper response to phenomena that challenged their understanding of the natural world. The Rooster's trial had transcended its origins as a local curiosity to become a focal point for broader philosophical and theological questions that touched the very foundations of medieval society. Private homes throughout Basel witnessed similar discussions as families gathered around their hearths to consider the implications of what they had observed. Parents struggled to explain to their children how a simple barnyard bird could become the subject of such grave legal proceedings, while their own understanding was tested by events that seemed to exist at the intersection of divine mystery and human jurisprudence. Picture yourself in the Great Hall once again, but now the atmosphere has shifted in subtle yet profound ways that speak to the gravity of the moment at hand. The air seems heavier, charged with anticipation and solemnity that marks those rare occasions when human institutions are called upon to address matters that transcend ordinary experience. The very stones of the building seem to hold their breath as history prepares to unfold within these ancient walls. The judges have reached their decision, after hours of deliberation that stretched through the night, consulting ancient texts whose wisdom had guided legal scholars for centuries, and seeking guidance from religious authorities whose understanding of supernatural matters had been honed through decades of study and pastoral experience. The weight of their responsibility is evident in their grave expressions and measured movements as they take their places at the bench, their robes of office seeming heavier than usual under the burden of pronouncing judgment in a case without precedent. The chief magistrate, a man whose long career had encompassed cases ranging from simple commercial disputes to complex matters of heresy and treason, now faced the most unusual challenge of his professional life. His weathered face bore the marks of countless difficult decisions, but none had required him to grapple with questions that challenged the very boundaries between natural and supernatural law, between divine justice and human understanding. The other judges, equally learned in the intricate traditions of medieval jurisprudence, arranged themselves according to the ancient protocols that governed such proceedings. Their presence lent authority to the moment, while emphasizing the collective nature of the decision that was about to be announced. These were not arbitrary rulers dispensing capricious justice, but scholars who had wrestled with complex legal and theological questions before reaching their conclusions. The rooster, still confined within his cage, remains utterly oblivious to the momentous decision about to be rendered, his ignorance of human proceedings serving as a poignant reminder of the vast gulf between animal consciousness and the complex moral and legal frameworks that govern human society. He pecks at scattered grain with the focused intensity that characterizes his species, preens his feathers with the meticulous care that birds devote to their appearance, and occasionally releases soft crows that seem almost conversational in their gentle tone. These simple, innocent actions seem almost heartbreaking in the context of what is about to unfold, their normalcy contrasting sharply with the extraordinary circumstances that have made this ordinary creature the center of such momentous legal proceedings. His bright eyes survey the assembled crowd with the same calm curiosity he might show toward any gathering of humans in his familiar barnyard, completely unaware that his fate hangs in the balance of deliberations that have engaged some of the finest legal minds of his era. The chief judge rises slowly, his movement marked by the ceremonial dignity that befits such occasions, his robes rustling in the hushed silence of the courtroom, with sounds that seem amplified by the tension that permeates the chamber. His voice, when he speaks, carries the weight of centuries of legal tradition, the authority of scholarly learning, and the gravity of this unprecedented moment in the history of jurisprudence. The verdict, delivered in the formal Latin of judicial proceedings that lends solemnity and universality to the court's pronouncement, echoes through the hall with terrible finality that seems to reverberate not only through the physical space, but through the consciousness of every person present. The words, carefully chosen according to established legal formulae, yet adapted to address circumstances that no previous generation had ever contemplated, ring out with unmistakable clarity, guilty as charged. The prosecution's arguments had ultimately proven more compelling to the medieval mind than the passionate and learned defense mounted by the rooster's advocate. Despite the young lawyer's impressive command of legal precedent and theological scholarship, the judges found themselves convinced by the biblical precedent of demons entering swine, which provided what they considered sufficient justification for believing that evil forces could indeed corrupt even the most innocent animals, and use them as instruments for spreading supernatural malevolence throughout the Christian community. The very existence of the egg was accepted as irrefutable evidence of supernatural intervention in the natural order, proof positive that forces opposed to divine will had been active within their community. The court determined that the safety of every soul in Basel required decisive action to eliminate this manifestation of evil, before it could spread to other animals, other households, or other aspects of their carefully ordered society. The reasoning behind the verdict reflected the complex theological understanding that dominated medieval intellectual life, a worldview that saw all events as part of an ongoing struggle between divine and demonic forces for control over human souls and earthly creation. While the judges acknowledged the advocate's arguments about involuntary action and the limitations of animal consciousness, they ultimately concluded that these considerations were overshadowed by more pressing concerns about supernatural corruption and community safety. In their view, the rooster had become an instrument of evil, regardless of his own intentions, understanding, or capacity for moral choice. The bird's innocence of conscious wrongdoing did not diminish the threat he represented to the spiritual welfare of the community, much as a plague victim might spread disease without intending harm to others. The corruption itself, rather than the intent behind it, constituted the danger that demanded immediate and decisive response. The theological framework that supported this reasoning drew upon centuries of Christian teaching about the nature of evil and its manifestations in the material world. The judges understood themselves to be acting not merely as arbiters of human law, but as guardians of divine order who had been entrusted with the responsibility of protecting their community from supernatural threats that could undermine the very foundations of Christian civilization. The sentence was pronounced with the same ceremonial gravity that marked all formal judicial proceedings, its language carefully crafted to reflect both the unprecedented nature of the case and the established traditions of medieval criminal justice. The rooster, along with the infamous egg that had initiated this entire extraordinary affair, was condemned to death by fire, the same method of execution employed for human criminals convicted of witchcraft, heresy, or other crimes involving supernatural corruption. The choice of execution by fire was not arbitrary, but reflected specific theological and practical considerations that governed medieval responses to supernatural threats. Fire was understood to possess purifying properties that could cleanse corruption and prevent its spread to other parts of the community. The flames would not merely end the rooster's life, but would symbolically cleanse the spiritual contamination that his alleged crimes had introduced into their midst. The execution would take place in the public square, where all citizens could witness the community's decisive rejection of supernatural corruption and its unwavering commitment to preserving the divine order that protected their souls from eternal damnation. The public nature of the proceedings served multiple purposes, demonstrating both the transparency of justice and the collective participation of the community in defending itself against spiritual threats. As the verdict was read, you could sense the complex mixture of emotions rippling through the assembled crowd, like stones dropped into still water, their reactions reflecting the various perspectives and concerns that this unprecedented case had brought to the surface. Some spectators felt a grim satisfaction that justice had been served, and that the threat to their community would be eliminated through proper legal channels, rather than mob violence or arbitrary punishment. Others experienced a quiet sadness at the fate of a creature that had never understood the human fears and superstitions that had sealed its doom, their hearts touched by the obvious innocence of an animal that had become entangled in forces far beyond its comprehension. The contrast between the rooster's simple animal nature and the complex theological and legal frameworks that had condemned him created a poignant reminder of the vast differences between human and animal consciousness. The rooster's advocate stood silent among the assembled officials, his shoulders bearing the weight of defeat despite his valiant efforts to save his unusual client, through arguments that had demonstrated both legal expertise and moral courage. His disappointment was evident not only in his personal failure to secure his client's acquittal, but in his recognition that the broader principles of justice and rational inquiry that he had attempted to champion had been overshadowed by fear and superstition. Yet, even in defeat, the young lawyer could take some satisfaction in knowing that he had provided the best possible defense under extremely challenging circumstances, that he had forced the court to grapple with fundamental questions about the nature of justice and moral responsibility, and that he had demonstrated the importance of legal representation, even in cases that seemed hopeless from the outset. The preparation for the execution began immediately following the pronouncement of sentence, as the efficient machinery of medieval justice moved to implement the court's decision with the same careful attention to procedure that had characterized the trial itself. In the medieval world, public executions served multiple purposes beyond simple punishment, functioning as community events that reinforced social bonds, demonstrated the power of law and order, and provided ritualistic cleansing of evil influences that threatened the spiritual welfare of the population. The rooster's execution would serve all these traditional functions, while also addressing the specific supernatural threat that his alleged egg-laying had represented to the community. The careful planning and ceremonial aspects of the proceedings would transform what might have been a simple animal slaughter into a meaningful act of spiritual purification that engaged the entire community in the defense of divine order. The town square, normally a bustling center of commercial activity, where merchants displayed their wares and citizens conducted the daily business of urban life, was cleared and prepared for its temporary transformation into a site of execution and spiritual renewal. The familiar sounds of commerce, the calls of vendors, the haggling of customers, the rumble of cart wheels on cobblestones, gave way to the more solemn preparations for an event that would be remembered long after normal market days had faded into collective memory. Workers constructed a wooden pyre in the center of the square with the same careful craftsmanship that they would bring to any important civic project, understanding that the structure would serve not merely as an instrument of execution, but as a symbol of the community's commitment to defending itself against supernatural threats. The wood was arranged according to principles that would ensure efficient burning while providing appropriate visibility for the assembled spectators. Guards took their positions around the execution site, their presence serving both practical and symbolic functions as they maintained order among the growing crowd, while representing the authority of law and the power of legitimate government to protect citizens from threats both natural and supernatural. Their uniforms and weapons marked them as representatives of earthly authority acting in service of divine justice. Word of the verdict and the scheduled execution spread through Basel's winding streets with the speed that accompanies all news of major civic importance, carried by messengers, servants, and ordinary citizens whose conversations transformed routine social interactions into urgent communications about events that transcended normal urban experience. The story spread beyond the city's walls to the surrounding countryside, drawing curious observers from villages and farms whose residents had followed the trial's progress with fascination and concern. Merchants throughout the city closed their shops early to witness this unprecedented event, understanding that they were about to observe something that would be discussed and remembered for generations to come. The temporary loss of business income seemed insignificant compared to the historical importance of participating in their community's response to supernatural corruption and their collective affirmation of divine order. Craftsmen abandoned their workshops, setting aside the tools and projects that normally occupied their attention during daylight hours. Master artisans stood alongside their apprentices, their usual hierarchical relationships temporarily suspended by their shared curiosity about events that challenged every assumption they had made about the normal boundaries of legal proceedings and community response to unexplained phenomena. Families gathered in the square as unified groups, parents recognizing the educational value of allowing their children to witness the community's decisive response to supernatural threats, while simultaneously struggling to explain the complex moral and theological issues that the case had raised. Children peered between the legs of adults, trying to catch glimpses of the infamous Rooster that had caused such extraordinary commotion in their ordinarily peaceful city. The execution site was prepared with the same meticulous attention to detail that marked all official proceedings in medieval Basel, reflecting the city's commitment to maintaining proper procedures even under unprecedented circumstances. The wooden pyre was constructed according to specifications that would ensure both effective execution and appropriate symbolism, while barriers were erected to maintain safe distances between the flames and the assembled spectators. The crowd that gathered represented a cross-section of Basel's entire population, from wealthy merchants whose commercial success had earned them positions of civic prominence, to common laborers whose daily toil sustained the city's economic foundation. Social distinctions that normally governed urban interactions seemed temporarily suspended by the shared fascination with events that transcended ordinary class boundaries and engaged fundamental questions about the nature of justice and supernatural threats. Religious authorities took prominent positions near the execution site, their presence lending spiritual authority to the proceedings, while providing reassurance to citizens who sought confirmation that the community's response to supernatural corruption enjoyed divine approval. Priests and monks, who had been consulted during the trial's preparation, now served as witnesses to its conclusion, their participation emphasizing the theological dimensions of the case. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the square and bathing the assembled crowd in the golden light that marked the approach of evening, the moment of execution finally arrived. The atmosphere in the square had grown increasingly solemn, as the reality of what was about to occur settled upon the consciousness of every person present. The Rooster was brought from his cage with the same careful attention to procedure that had characterized every aspect of his legal proceedings, his handlers treating him with the respect due to any condemned prisoner, while maintaining the security measures necessary to ensure proper execution of the court's sentence. His demeanor remained unchanged from what observers had witnessed throughout the trial, calm, curious, utterly unaware of the human drama that had made him the center of such extraordinary attention. The infamous egg, that small oval object whose discovery had triggered this entire remarkable sequence of events, was carefully transported to the execution site and placed beside the Rooster on the pyre. The symbolism was deliberately clear, both the creature allegedly responsible for supernatural corruption and the physical evidence of that corruption would be destroyed together, eliminating every trace of the threat that had endangered their community's spiritual welfare. The crowd fell into complete silence as the executioner, a professional whose skills were normally employed in cases involving human criminals, prepared to carry out the court's sentence with the same efficiency and dignity that marked all his work. His movements were deliberate and respectful, reflecting his understanding that he was performing not merely a practical task, but a ritual act that served crucial spiritual and social functions for the entire community. The flames began small, crackling softly as they caught the dry wood at the base of the pyre, with sounds that seemed amplified by the profound silence that had settled over the square. The fire's initial growth was gradual, allowing spectators to observe the careful craftsmanship that had gone into the pyre's construction, while building anticipation for the climactic moment when the court's sentence would be fully executed. The Rooster's final moments were brief and dignified, his end coming with the same peaceful acceptance that had characterized his entire involvement in these extraordinary proceedings. He faced his fate without apparent fear or understanding, maintaining the innocent bearing that had made his legal situation so poignant throughout the trial. His death was swift and merciful, reflecting the court's recognition that he was more victim than villain in the supernatural drama that had unfolded around him. The egg, that crucial piece of evidence whose existence had provided the foundation for all the charges against the Rooster, was consumed alongside him in flames that served both practical and symbolic purposes. Its destruction represented the community's triumph over the supernatural forces they believed had threatened their peace, while the fire's purifying action cleansed any lingering corruption that might have remained to endanger other members of their society. The smoke rose steadily into the late afternoon sky, carrying with it the physical remnants of what the people of Basel perceived as a genuine threat to their spiritual welfare and their community's divinely ordained order. The grey column that ascended toward heaven seemed to many observers to represent their prayers for protection and their gratitude for deliverance from supernatural dangers that could have had far more serious consequences if left unchecked. The crowd watched in solemn silence as the flames did their purifying work, each observer drawing their own conclusions about the meaning of what they had witnessed, and its implications for their understanding of justice, divine will, and the proper response to phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of natural law. The shared experience created bonds of community solidarity, while reinforcing collective commitment to the values and beliefs that defined their society. For many in the crowd, the execution represented a necessary and righteous victory over evil forces that constantly threatened their medieval world, confirming their belief that vigilance against supernatural corruption was essential for maintaining the divine order that protected their community from spiritual and physical dangers. They saw in the Rooster's fate a powerful reminder that their authorities possessed both the wisdom to recognize supernatural threats and the courage to take decisive action against them. The swift and decisive action taken by their legal and religious authorities demonstrated that Basel would not tolerate any manifestation of demonic influence, regardless of how seemingly innocent or insignificant it might appear to untrained observers. The thoroughness of the legal proceedings and the dignity of the execution proved that their community possessed the institutional strength and moral clarity necessary to defend itself against threats that transcended ordinary human experience. Others in the crowd, despite their acceptance of the verdict and their support for the authorities' actions, felt a quiet unease about what they had witnessed, an emotional response that they struggled to reconcile with their intellectual understanding of the case's necessity. Despite their belief in the court's wisdom and their acceptance of the supernatural explanation for the Rooster's alleged crimes, they could not entirely shake the feeling that an innocent creature had suffered for human fears and superstitions that might have distorted their perception of events. The Rooster's obvious lack of understanding about his situation, his simple animal behavior throughout the trial, and his peaceful demeanor in his final moments created a troubling contrast with the gravity of the charges against him and the severity of the punishment he had received. These observers found themselves questioning whether justice had truly been served, or whether fear and superstition had overwhelmed rational judgment in ways that dishonored the very legal traditions they sought to uphold. The execution also served as a powerful and sobering reminder of the precarious nature of life in the medieval world, where the boundary between safety and danger, between the natural and supernatural, seemed constantly under threat from forces beyond human control or understanding. The Rooster's fate demonstrated how quickly ordinary life could be disrupted by phenomena that challenged conventional understanding, transforming peaceful domestic routines into matters of life and death. In a world where disease, warfare, and natural disasters were constant threats to individual and community survival, the possibility of supernatural corruption added yet another layer of uncertainty and danger to daily existence. The need for constant vigilance against spiritual threats created psychological pressures that shaped every aspect of medieval life, from personal devotions to community institutions, designed to protect against forces that conventional human resources could not address. As the flames gradually died down, and the pyre collapsed into glowing embers that would soon turn to ash, the crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, as if departing from a church service or religious festival that had provided spiritual sustenance along with dramatic entertainment. The people of Basel carried with them the memory of this extraordinary day, an experience that would influence their understanding of justice, divine providence, and community solidarity for the rest of their lives. The Rooster's execution had provided a ritualistic cleansing of their community that went far beyond the simple elimination of a perceived threat, creating a shared experience that reinforced social bonds while demonstrating their collective commitment to maintaining the divine order that governed their lives. The public nature of the proceedings had allowed every citizen to participate in their community's defense against supernatural corruption, creating a sense of unity and common purpose that transcended normal social divisions. But the execution had also raised profound and troubling questions about the nature of justice, the limits of animal consciousness, the proper response to unexplained phenomena, and the relationship between human authority and divine will. These questions would continue to resonate in the minds of thoughtful observers long after the immediate excitement of the trial and execution had faded into memory. The ashes of the rooster and his egg were scattered according to prescribed rituals designed to prevent any possibility that physical remnants of supernatural corruption might linger to threaten future generations. The complete destruction of all material evidence eliminated the last tangible traces of the threat that had gripped the city, while the dispersal of the ashes ensured that no shrine or memorial could develop around the site of execution. The townspeople returned to their homes, their shops, and their daily routines with the satisfaction that comes from witnessing decisive action against perceived threats, secure in the knowledge that their authorities had acted wisely and courageously to protect them from corruption that could have spread throughout their community if left unchecked. The rhythm of normal life resumed with renewed appreciation for the peace and order that effective governance provided. The memory of the rooster's trial would linger in the collective consciousness of Basel for generations to come, becoming part of the city's oral tradition, and contributing to its reputation as a place where justice was administered fairly and supernatural threats were addressed with appropriate seriousness. The case would be discussed in legal schools, theological seminaries, and popular gatherings as an example of how medieval institutions could adapt to address unprecedented challenges while maintaining their commitment to established principles of law and faith. Yet questions raised by the trial would also persist, creating ongoing debates about the nature of justice, the limits of human understanding, and the proper relationship between earthly and divine authority that would influence legal and theological scholarship for centuries. The rooster of Basel had become more than a simple barnyard bird. He had become a symbol of the eternal human struggle to understand and respond to mysteries that challenge the boundaries of conventional knowledge and institutional capability. Chapter 4. Superstition, on trial. In the quiet days that followed the rooster's execution, as the smoke from the pyre had long since dissipated into the clear Swiss air, and the ashes had been scattered to the winds according to prescribed ritual, the people of Basel gradually returned to the familiar rhythms of their daily lives, with a mixture of relief and barely acknowledged uncertainty. The merchants reopened their stalls with renewed confidence, their conversations returning to matters of trade and profit rather than supernatural corruption. The craftsmen returned to their workshops with steady hands, focusing their attention on the tangible realities of their trades, rather than the mysteries that had so recently disrupted their peaceful existence. The children played in the streets without the immediate shadow of supernatural dread that had hung over their city like a storm cloud threatening to break at any moment, their laughter once again echoing through the narrow alleys and courtyards where they had always found joy in simple games and innocent mischief. Yet beneath this surface normalcy, this deliberate return to routine and predictability, something profound had shifted in the collective consciousness of the community, in ways that would only become fully apparent as months and years passed. Picture yourself walking through the narrow streets of Basel in the weeks following the trial, your feet finding their way along pathways that have been traversed by countless generations before you. The cobblestones beneath your feet are worn smooth by the passage of countless footsteps, each stone polished by decades of daily traffic, their surfaces telling silent stories of the merchants, craftsmen, clergy, and common citizens who have shaped this city's character through their collective presence and shared experiences. The timber-framed houses that line these ancient streets lean comfortably against each other like old friends, sharing secrets accumulated over centuries of neighborly proximity. Their weathered wood speaking of seasons survived and storms weathered together. The architectural details that catch your eye, carved window frames, decorative shutters, ornate doorways, represent the accumulated artistic expression of generations of Basel's craftsmen, each element contributing to the visual narrative that defines the city's identity. The air carries the familiar and comforting sense of bread baking in ovens that have fed the city's families for generations, leather being worked by tanners, whose techniques have been passed down from father to son since the guilds first established their standards and practices, and the distant but persistent aroma of brewing ale from establishments that have served the community's social and recreational needs for longer than most residents can remember. But listen carefully to the conversations drifting from doorways and market stalls, floating through open windows where families gather for their evening meals, and emerging from workshops where craftsmen labor alongside their apprentices, and you will hear something new threading through the traditional patterns of daily discourse. There is a subtle questioning in these conversations, a gentle but persistent probing of assumptions that had seemed so certain and unshakable just days before the Rooster's trial began. The questions being asked are not voiced as direct challenges to established authority or fundamental beliefs, for such open rebellion would be both dangerous and inconsistent with the medieval worldview that shaped every aspect of these people's understanding of reality. Instead, they emerge as tentative wonderings, careful explorations of possibilities that might exist alongside accepted truths rather than in opposition to them. The Rooster's trial had accomplished far more than simply eliminating a perceived supernatural threat from their community. It had inadvertently created a moment of collective reflection about the nature of fear, the limits of human understanding, and the sometimes tragic consequences of acting upon incomplete knowledge when that action could not be reversed or corrected. The people of Basel had witnessed their legal system, an institution they respected and trusted, grapple with questions that had no easy answers, and many found themselves quietly wondering about the wisdom of some beliefs they had inherited from their ancestors. Some citizens began to discuss, in hushed tones that reflected both curiosity and caution, the possibility that the rooster's egg might have had a perfectly natural explanation that their current understanding of the world simply could not encompass. Perhaps there were aspects of animal behavior that remained mysterious to human observation, despite centuries of domestic life shared between people and the creatures they depended upon for sustenance and labor. Perhaps the boundaries between male and female characteristics in the natural world were not as rigid and immutable as they had always assumed, influenced by forces or processes that their limited knowledge of biology and anatomy could not yet comprehend. These conversations were necessarily tentative and careful, conducted among trusted friends and family members, for questioning established truths required considerable courage in a world where orthodoxy provided not only spiritual comfort but practical safety from accusations of heresy or dangerous thinking. The very fact that such conversations were taking place at all represented a significant shift in the intellectual climate of Basel, a community that had previously accepted the explanations provided by authority figures without substantial question or doubt. The Rooster's trial had demonstrated that even learned men, working within established legal and theological frameworks, could reach conclusions that seemed troubling to ordinary citizens who possessed their own capacity for moral reasoning and emotional response. The advocate who had defended the Rooster found himself the subject of considerable attention and discussion in the days and weeks following the trial, his role in the proceedings making him a focal point for the community's complex feelings about what they had witnessed. Many citizens praised his eloquent arguments and his willingness to challenge prevailing assumptions, even in defense of a creature that most had considered already doomed by the nature of the charges against it. These supporters saw in the young lawyer's efforts a demonstration of the highest ideals of their legal system, the commitment to providing every accused individual with competent representation, the willingness to test evidence and assumptions through rigorous argument, and the courage to stand up for principles of justice even when doing so might prove unpopular or professionally risky. They viewed his passionate defense as evidence that their community possessed the institutional strength and moral character necessary to address even the most unprecedented challenges fairly and thoroughly. Others, however, viewed his efforts with suspicion and concern, wondering privately whether his passionate defense of the Rooster might indicate sympathy for the dark forces they believed had corrupted the bird, or whether his arguments might reflect dangerous thinking that could undermine the foundations of Christian society. These critics worried that too much questioning of established beliefs, even when conducted within legal proceedings, might create intellectual space for more serious challenges to religious and social authority. The young lawyer himself seemed profoundly changed by the experience of defending such an unusual client under such extraordinary circumstances. Those who knew him well observed that he carried himself with a quiet dignity that suggested both pride in his professional efforts and deep sadness at their ultimate failure to save his client's life. His subsequent legal practice reflected a new depth of commitment to defending clients who faced difficult circumstances, as if his experience with the Rooster had strengthened his understanding of the advocate's essential role in protecting the rights of those who could not protect themselves. Religious authorities throughout Basel and the surrounding region used the trial as an opportunity to reinforce fundamental teachings about the constant presence of evil in the world and the need for perpetual vigilance against supernatural corruption that could threaten both individual souls and a broader Christian community. Sermons delivered from pulpits throughout the city emphasized the community's righteous response to the perceived threat and praised the wisdom of their judicial system in recognizing and eliminating the danger before it could spread to other animals, other households, or other aspects of their carefully ordered society. These religious interpretations of the trial's significance drew upon centuries of Christian teaching about spiritual warfare and the ongoing struggle between divine and demonic forces for control over earthly creation. The rooster's fate was presented as an example of how faithful communities should respond to supernatural threats, demonstrating both the importance of taking such matters seriously and the effectiveness of proper legal and religious procedures in addressing them. Yet even among the clergy, some found themselves privately questioning whether the destruction of an obviously innocent creature had truly served the cause of divine justice, or whether the fear and confusion that had driven the proceedings might have distorted their understanding of God's will. These doubts were rarely expressed openly, for challenging the theological interpretation of events required questioning fundamental assumptions about the nature of evil and the proper relationship between earthly and divine authority. The discomfort felt by some religious authorities reflected broader tensions within medieval Christianity, between the demands of doctrinal orthodoxy and the compassionate impulses that drew many people to religious life in the first place. The rooster's obvious innocence of any conscious wrongdoing, combined with his peaceful acceptance of his fate, created a disturbing parallel to other innocent suffering that challenged simplified explanations of divine justice and moral order. The rooster's trial quickly became a subject of intense scholarly discussion in the universities and monasteries of the region, where learned men gathered to debate the theological implications of the case, the proper interpretation of biblical precedents, and the relationship between natural law and supernatural intervention. These academic discussions, conducted in the careful Latin of intellectual discourse, revealed the complex philosophical underpinnings of medieval thought and the genuine intellectual struggles that such unprecedented cases created for scholars attempting to maintain consistency in their worldview. University professors of law and theology found themselves grappling with questions that had no clear answers in existing texts or established traditions. The rooster's case forced them to consider fundamental issues about the nature of consciousness, the requirements for moral responsibility, and the proper interpretation of biblical accounts of demonic possession. Their debates generated new scholarship that attempted to address these questions while remaining consistent with Christian doctrine and established legal principles. Monastic communities, with their emphasis on contemplation and spiritual reflection, provided different perspectives on the trial's significance. Some monks saw in the rooster's fate a reminder of the world's fallen nature and the tragic consequences of sin's corruption of God's creation. Others found themselves troubled by the apparent arbitrariness of the bird's punishment and the contrast between the peaceful animal's behavior and the violent response it had provoked. The scholarly discussions generated by the trial contributed to broader intellectual developments within medieval universities, where the case became a reference point for debates about the relationship between reason and faith, the limits of human knowledge, and the proper methods for investigating natural phenomena. The rooster's trial demonstrated both the sophistication of medieval intellectual life and the constraints that religious orthodoxy placed on scholarly inquiry. As months passed, and news travelled along the trade routes that connected Basel to distant markets and centres of learning, the story of the Basel rooster began to spread far beyond the city's walls, carried by merchants, pilgrims, scholars, and other travellers who found in it a tale that combined elements of legal drama, theological debate, and human tragedy that made it memorable and worth retelling. Travellers carried the tale to distant markets and royal courts, where it was received with mixtures of amazement, horror, and quiet reflection that reflected the diverse perspectives and cultural contexts of the various communities where it was told. Some listeners interpreted it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of supernatural corruption and the importance of decisive action against such threats, viewing Basel's response as a model for how Christian communities should address similar challenges. Others found in the story a troubling example of how fear and superstition could lead even well-intentioned people to commit acts they might later regret, seeing in the rooster's fate a warning about the dangers of acting upon incomplete understanding when the consequences of error could not be reversed. These listeners were particularly struck by the contrast between the animal's obvious innocence and the severity of the punishment he received. The international reception of the rooster's story reflected broader tensions within medieval European society about the proper balance between religious authority and secular governance, between traditional beliefs and emerging forms of rational inquiry, and between collective security and individual rights. Different communities emphasized different aspects of the tale depending upon their own experiences with supernatural threats, legal innovation, and social change. The tale evolved significantly as it traveled from community to community, taking on new details and interpretations with each telling that reflected the cultural concerns and intellectual frameworks of different audiences. In some versions, the rooster's advocate became a heroic figure who challenged the entire system of superstitious justice, representing the power of reason and compassion to confront irrational fear and institutional oppression. In other versions, he was portrayed as a dangerous radical whose arguments had threatened the very foundations of Christian society by questioning established religious teachings and encouraging doubt about supernatural phenomena. These variations in the story's telling revealed the deep divisions within medieval society about the proper relationship between intellectual inquiry and religious faith. The rooster himself was sometimes depicted as a tragic victim of human ignorance and fear, an innocent creature whose suffering demonstrated the need for greater compassion and understanding in human relationships with the natural world. In other tellings, he remained a genuinely corrupted creature whose destruction had been necessary for the community's spiritual and physical survival, with his advocates' arguments representing misguided sympathy that could have endangered innocent lives. These different interpretations of the same basic events demonstrated the power of narrative to shape understanding and the ways in which individual and community perspectives could transform factual occurrences into stories that served different moral and political purposes. The rooster's trial became a kind of mirror that reflected the concerns and values of each community that encountered its story. Medieval chroniclers, those careful and methodical recorders of significant events whose work would preserve the period's history for future generations, struggled with how to present the rooster's trial to readers who might live centuries in the future. They recognized its importance as a legal and social phenomenon that illuminated fundamental aspects of their society, while also acknowledging the strange and potentially troubling nature of the proceedings that made them difficult to explain or justify. Their accounts reflect the tension between their professional duty to record events accurately and their awareness that some stories might be difficult for later readers to understand or accept, without substantial context about the beliefs and fears that shaped medieval responses to unexplained phenomena. Some chroniclers emphasized the legal and procedural aspects of the case, focusing on its significance for the development of judicial institutions and the treatment of unprecedented legal questions. Others concentrated on the theological dimensions of the trial, presenting it as an example of how Christian communities should respond to supernatural threats, while acknowledging the complex moral questions that such responses could raise. Still others attempted to provide balanced accounts that presented multiple perspectives on the events, while avoiding explicit criticism of either the authorities who condemned the rooster or the advocate who defended him. The chronicler's difficulties in presenting the rooster's story reflected broader challenges faced by medieval historians who attempted to record events that seemed to exist at the intersection of natural and supernatural phenomena. Their work required balancing respect for religious authority with commitment to factual accuracy, while also considering the needs and perspectives of future readers who might possess different frameworks for understanding such events. The broader implications of the Basel rooster trial extended far beyond questions of supernatural corruption or animal behavior to illuminate fundamental tensions within medieval society about the nature of justice, the limits of human knowledge, and the proper response to unexplained phenomena that challenged established understanding of natural law and divine order. The case had revealed the sophistication of medieval legal thinking in its careful attention to procedural requirements, its recognition of the defendant's right to representation, and its systematic approach to evaluating evidence and arguments. Yet, it had also demonstrated the profound influence of superstition and fear on even the most learned minds of the era, showing how religious beliefs and cultural assumptions could shape legal proceedings in ways that modern observers might find troubling or irrational. Consider how the trial reflected the medieval struggle to reconcile faith and reason, tradition and innovation, collective security and individual conscience within a unified intellectual framework that could address both practical governance needs and spiritual requirements. The judges who condemned the Rooster were not cruel or ignorant men seeking to abuse their authority, but products of their time who genuinely believed they were protecting their community from genuine threats that required immediate and decisive response. Their decision reflected centuries of Christian teaching about spiritual warfare, biblical precedents for demonic possession of animals, and legal traditions that recognized the need to address supernatural threats through established judicial procedures. Within the intellectual framework that shaped their understanding of reality, their conclusion was logical and defensible, even if it seems troubling to modern sensibilities. The advocate who defended the bird was similarly not a modern rationalist, attempting to introduce secular scientific thinking into religious legal proceedings, but a medieval lawyer who worked skillfully within the intellectual frameworks of his era, while pushing those frameworks to their limits in service of his client's interests. His arguments drew upon the same theological and legal traditions that supported the prosecution's case, but applied them in ways that challenged conventional interpretations and assumptions. His willingness to argue for the Rooster's innocence demonstrated the genuine intellectual vitality of medieval legal thought, and its capacity for innovation and adaptation when confronted with unprecedented circumstances. His efforts also revealed the moral courage required to advocate for unpopular positions when professional advancement and social acceptance might depend upon conformity with prevailing opinions. The Rooster's fate also illuminated the complex and often contradictory relationship between humans and animals in medieval society, where creatures could simultaneously be seen as part of God's creation, deserving of care and protection, and as potential instruments of evil, requiring constant vigilance and occasional decisive intervention. Animals occupied a unique position in medieval thought, possessing souls that entitled them to some moral consideration, while lacking the rational capacity that would make them fully responsible for their actions. This paradoxical status allowed animals to be blessed by priests during religious ceremonies, tried in courts of law for alleged crimes, and executed for offenses against divine and human authority, while remaining fundamentally outside the moral universe that governed human behavior and eternal salvation. The intellectual space created by this paradox made it possible for a rooster to be considered both innocent and guilty, both deserving of legal defense and worthy of capital punishment. The tensions revealed by the rooster's trial reflected broader questions about the nature of consciousness, moral responsibility, and the proper relationship between rational and irrational elements in human decision-making that would continue to challenge thinkers for centuries. The case demonstrated the difficulty of applying human legal and moral categories to natural phenomena that might not conform to human expectations or understanding. As the years passed and the immediate emotions surrounding the trial faded into memory, replaced by newer concerns and more pressing challenges facing the community, the Rooster of Basel began to assume a different and more symbolic role in the collective memory of the city. He became a representative figure of the period's complex relationship with the unknown, a reminder of how fear and superstition could shape even the most sophisticated legal proceedings when combined with genuine uncertainty about phenomena that challenged conventional understanding. His story served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of acting upon incomplete understanding, when the consequences of error could not be reversed, while also demonstrating the genuine intellectual and moral struggles that such unprecedented situations created for people attempting to balance competing obligations and values. The rooster became a symbol of innocent suffering, but also of the tragic consequences that could result from the collision between human fear and institutional authority. The trial also highlighted the courage required to challenge prevailing assumptions and defend unpopular positions, even when doing so might bring personal risk or social disapproval. The rooster's advocate had shown that intellectual honesty sometimes demanded standing up for principles that others might consider dangerous or subversive, demonstrating the timeless importance of principled advocacy and the defense of those who could not defend themselves. His willingness to argue for the innocence of a creature that most considered already doomed illustrated the essential role that skilled advocacy could play in testing evidence, challenging assumptions, and ensuring that even the most unusual defendants received fair consideration of their circumstances. His efforts represented the legal system's capacity for self-examination and improvement, even when that capacity proved insufficient to prevent tragic outcomes. In the broader context of medieval European history, the Basel rooster trial represented a moment when the intellectual foundations of traditional society were tested by circumstances that revealed both their strengths and their limitations. The case demonstrated the sophistication of medieval legal thought, while also illustrating the constraints that religious orthodoxy and cultural assumptions placed upon rational inquiry and moral reasoning. The trial occurred during a period of significant intellectual and social change within European civilization, as new forms of learning and communication began to challenge traditional authorities and established ways of understanding the natural world. The Rooster's case became part of this broader transformation, contributing to ongoing debates about the proper relationship between faith and reason, authority and individual conscience, tradition and innovation. The questions raised by the trial would continue to resonate through subsequent centuries, as European society gradually developed new approaches to understanding natural phenomena, legal responsibility, and the proper treatment of those who could not speak for themselves. The Rooster's story became part of the intellectual heritage that would eventually contribute to more sophisticated understanding of animal behavior, legal rights, and the dangers of allowing fear to override rational judgment. In the end, the Rooster executed in Basel during the summer of 1474 became far more than just a curious footnote in the annals of legal history or an amusing anecdote about medieval superstition. He became a powerful symbol of the medieval world's complex relationship with mystery, authority, and justice, representing both the genuine intellectual achievements of the period and the tragic consequences that could result from the collision between human fear and institutional power. His trial revealed the sophisticated legal thinking that characterized the best medieval jurisprudence, while also demonstrating the profound influence of superstition and fear on even the most learned minds of the era. His fate illustrated both the importance of institutional procedures for addressing unprecedented challenges and the dangers of applying those procedures when understanding of the relevant phenomena remained incomplete or distorted by cultural assumptions. The legacy of the Basel Rooster trial extends far beyond its immediate historical context to illuminate timeless questions about the nature of justice, the limits of human knowledge, and the proper response to phenomena that challenge our understanding of the world around us. It reminds us that even the most well-intentioned efforts to protect our communities can sometimes lead to outcomes that later generations find difficult to understand, accept, or justify. The trial also demonstrates the importance of maintaining intellectual humility in the face of uncertainty, the value of principled advocacy for those who cannot advocate for themselves, and the need for constant vigilance against the tendency to allow fear and prejudice to override rational judgment and moral compassion. These lessons remain as relevant today as they were in medieval Basel, reminding us that the pursuit of truth and justice requires both intellectual courage and moral restraint. As you drift toward peaceful sleep, perhaps you can find some comfort in the knowledge that the questions raised by the Rooster's trial continue to resonate through the centuries, challenging each generation to examine its own assumptions and improve its responses to the mysteries and uncertainties that define human existence. The struggle to balance reason and faith, security and justice, tradition and innovation remains as relevant today as it was in medieval Basel, requiring the same combination of intellectual honesty and moral courage that the Rooster's advocate demonstrated during those extraordinary proceedings. The Rooster's story serves as a gentle reminder that human knowledge is always incomplete, that our understanding of the world continues to evolve through experience and reflection, and that the pursuit of truth and justice requires both the wisdom to acknowledge our limitations and the courage to act according to our highest principles, even when the outcome remains uncertain. The cobblestones of Basel still bear the invisible impressions of those who witnessed that extraordinary trial, while the memory of the Rooster who faced his fate with innocent dignity continues to whisper its timeless lessons to those who pause to listen. In the end, his legacy lies not in the specific details of his case, but in the enduring questions it raises about our responsibilities to each other and to the world we share, questions that each generation must answer according to its own understanding and moral convictions. As our journey through the streets of medieval Basel draws to a close, we leave behind a world where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural seemed far more permeable than they do today. The Rooster whose fate we have followed was more than just a barnyard bird. He was a symbol of the medieval world's complex relationship with mystery, authority, and the constant struggle to understand the unknown. In the quiet comfort of your modern surroundings, you can rest assured that the questions which so troubled the people of Basel in 1474 continue to find new answers with each passing generation. The courage shown by the Rooster's advocate in defending the defenseless, the genuine concern of the judges for their community's welfare, and the innocent dignity of the bird himself all remind us that even in our darkest historical moments, human nature reveals both its limitations and its nobility. The cobblestones of Basel have been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and the timber-framed houses that witnessed that extraordinary trial have long since given way to newer structures. Yet the memory of the rooster's story continues to offer gentle lessons about the importance of intellectual humility, the dangers of acting upon incomplete understanding, and the timeless value of principled advocacy in the face of popular opposition. As you settle into the peaceful rhythm of sleep, let the rooster's tale serve as a reminder that human knowledge continues to evolve, that our understanding of the world grows deeper with each passing age, and that the pursuit of truth and justice requires both courage and compassion. The medieval world that condemned an innocent bird for supernatural corruption seems distant now, but the human struggles it revealed remain eternally relevant. Sleep well, dear listener, secure in the knowledge that while the questions facing humanity may change with the centuries, the fundamental human capacity for growth, learning, and moral progress continues to light our way forward through the darkness of ignorance and fear. The Rooster of Basel, in his innocent dignity, reminds us that even the smallest creatures can teach us profound lessons about justice, mercy, and the endless human quest to understand our place in the vast mystery of existence.